It was 1951. A man named Robert Calloway lived in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee, and had been with a woman named Dorothy Marsh for 11 months. One evening, Robert went to Dorothy's father's house, knocked on the door, and said he wanted to speak with the man privately. They sat in the front room for 20 minutes. Robert came out, walked to the kitchen where Dorothy was waiting with excitement, and only one sentence came out of his mouth. "Your father said yes." They married 6 months later. 61 years later, when his grandchildren asked Dorothy what she remembered about the night Robert proposed, she didn't talk about the ring. She didn't talk about the speech. "He got my father's approval first," she said, "and I understood then what kind of man he was." Before we go any further, I want to ask you this question. What did Robert Calloway know about choosing a partner that today's men have completely forgotten? No dating apps, no algorithms, no social media profiles, a generation whose divorce rate was roughly 25%, while today's rate is close to 50%. What is the real reason for that? I won't answer that yet. Before we get to number 7, subscribe to Frank. If you're a man over 40 who's tired of being told that the old ways were wrong, this channel exists for exactly that reason. And be sure to share in the comments which methods you used. Guide the new generation of men. Rule number 1. They looked for a woman whose word meant something. It was 1953. A man named George Hartwell was seeing a woman named Ruth Pfeiffer in Cincinnati. George had taken Ruth out to dinner 6 times. On the 7th, Ruth told George she would meet him at the cinema at 7 o'clock. At 7:15, she arrived, slightly flustered, with an explanation about her sister and a broken heel. George listened. He was polite about it, but on the drive home, he said something Ruth remembered for the rest of her life. "I don't keep score, but I pay attention." They married 2 years later. Ruth Pfeiffer Hartwell was never late to anything important again, not because George demanded it, but because she understood what he felt. In 1953, researcher Leon Festinger published foundational work on cognitive consistency, the human tendency to align small behaviors with larger values. A person who is consistently on time is not just punctual. They are telling you, with every small act, that they consider your time worth keeping. Unfortunately, today's dating system has inverted this. Showing up late was renamed confidence. Not responding began to be called playing it cool. Modern love relationship coaching was built on the premise that inconsistency is attractive. George Hartwell would have called that a warning sign. Watch the small details. What is real is hidden in the small details. Rule number 2. They looked for a woman who could stay calm. Harold Briggs was a pipe fitter in Akron, Ohio. In 1955, he met a woman named Margaret Lowe through friends at a church social. They sat together for 2 hours. Harold talked. Margaret listened not politely, not while waiting for her turn, but genuinely. She asked 2 questions the whole evening, both specific, both showing she had been paying attention to what he actually said. Harold went home and told his brother he had found the woman he was going to marry. His brother asked what she was like. Harold thought for a moment and said, "She doesn't fill silence with noise." Margaret Lowe became Margaret Briggs in 1956. Their son Thomas, in a family memoir written in 2003, described his parents' marriage as comfortable quiet, the ability to sit together without needing to perform for each other or fill the space between them. A 1958 study of long-term marital satisfaction by sociologist Ernest Burgess at the University of Chicago identified companionate compatibility as the single strongest predictor of marital endurance. Not passion, not physical attraction, the ability to be together without friction, to be together without constantly needing entertainment or interaction. The social media age has raised a generation that moves on the approval of others. Research by Asurion found the average American checks their phone over 90 times per day. Silence is treated as awkward. An entire generation has been trained to perform presence to appear engaged while being somewhere else entirely. Harold Briggs found a woman who didn't need to perform, who could sit and listen and ask a real question. He knew what that was worth. Rule number 3. They looked for a woman who was loyal before she had any reason to be. Stay with me, because this is the rule that separates everything else. In 1957, a man named Walter Kincaid was passed over for a promotion at the steel company in Pittsburgh, where he had worked for 6 years. The promotion went to a younger man with a college degree Walter didn't have. Walter came home and told his wife Helen what had happened, straightforwardly, without drama. Helen did not tell Walter the company was wrong. She did not perform outrage on his behalf. She poured 2 cups of coffee, sat down across from her husband and said, "What do you want to do now?" That question. What do you want to do now? Not who is to blame, not how to feel about it. What are we going to do now? Walter stayed at that company. He was promoted twice in the following 4 years. In a letter to his son, written in 1971, he attributed it to the fact that Helen had never allowed him to become a man who believed the world owed him something. She was loyal to his potential, not to his grievances. Research published in the Journal of Marriage and Family in 1960 found that spousal encouragement, specifically the tendency to direct attention forward rather than backward in moments of setback, was one of the strongest predictors of male career achievement through the 1950s. The researchers called it forward-facing support. Helen Kincaid had never read that research. She understood that a man encouraged to nurse a grievance eventually becomes his grievance. The loyalty that mattered to men of that era was not the loyalty of agreement, it was the loyalty of forward motion. Standing beside a man not because he was right, but because he was capable of being better. The next few are the ones people never talk about, and they're the ones that actually explain the numbers. Rule number 4. They looked for a woman who had been raised with expectations. In 1954, Frank Dolan was introduced through friends to a woman named Dorothy Schaefer at a dinner party in Baltimore. Dorothy was 23. She had been raised by a father who expected her to be on time, finish what she started, keep her word, and take responsibility when she was wrong. Frank noticed something specific that evening. When she spilled a glass of water, she didn't make it a spectacle. She didn't over-apologize or perform distress. She cleaned it up, said, "I'm sorry," and continued the conversation. Frank told his friend that night that Dorothy Schaefer was the kind of woman a man could build a life with. His friend asked how he could tell. Frank said, "The way she handled that spill, she took responsibility without theater." Sociologists studying family formation in the post-war period found consistently that women raised in households with high but fair expectations, where accountability was taught rather than punished, demonstrated measurably higher marital stability than those raised in either permissive or authoritarian homes. A 1,959 study by Talcott Parsons at Harvard found that internalized role competence standards, absorbed as genuinely one's own rather than externally imposed, was among the strongest predictors of successful partnership. Frank Dolan was not running a psychological profile. He was watching how Dorothy handled spilled water, the same information, a different way of reading it. The modern dating industry has trained men to evaluate partners primarily on physical appearance and emotional chemistry in the first 30 minutes. The spilled glass is invisible in that framework, which is why the framework produces such reliably poor results. Rule number 5. They looked for a woman who respected her own family even when it was complicated. Harold Fenwick, a different Harold, this one from Columbus, Ohio, had been dating a woman named Ruth Malone for 3 months in 1956. When he noticed something, every time Ruth's mother called, Ruth answered, sometimes with exasperation, but she answered. She showed up to her parents' house on Sundays. She helped her younger sister with problems that weren't her responsibility, without being asked, without making them a story about herself. Harold had also dated a woman the previous year who spoke about her family almost exclusively in terms of what they had done wrong, what her mother had failed to give her, what her father had never understood. Harold noticed the difference immediately. Ruth had complaints, he heard them occasionally, but they never became her identity. Harold Fenwick married Ruth Malone in 1957. They were married for 44 years. Psychologist John Bowlby's foundational work on attachment theory, published in 1958, established that the way a person relates to their earliest caregivers becomes the template for how they relate to everyone else. What the men of the 1950s understood intuitively before that language existed is that a woman who could maintain a functional, if imperfect, his relationship with her own parents was demonstrating something important about her capacity for the long road. The modern culture of therapy has made it acceptable, even fashionable, to define yourself by the ways your family failed you. Harold Fenwick wouldn't have called it a red flag. He would have said the woman in front of him had decided her story was already written. He preferred the woman who was still writing hers. I want to stop here and say something honest. I grew up evaluating women the way the culture said to how they looked, how exciting they were in the first few weeks, how much chemistry there was in the opening act. I thought the older generation was naive. I thought they settled. I thought the lack of passion in those long marriages was evidence of something missing. I was wrong, and I figured that out too late and the hard way. What those men were doing was not settling. They were selecting. Deliberately, patiently, with criteria invisible to anyone not paying attention. They weren't looking for the most exciting woman in the room. They were looking for the woman who would still be worth knowing 40 years from now. That is a completely different project, and almost nobody is teaching it anymore. Rule number 6. They looked for a woman who could disagree without destroying. It was 1952. George Alderman and his wife, Carol, married 3 years, were having an argument in their kitchen in Springfield, Illinois. George wanted to make a significant financial decision. Carol thought he was wrong. She said so directly, with her reasons, without raising her voice, without questioning his character or his intentions. She disagreed with the decision, not the man. George made the decision anyway. It cost the family several months of savings. Carol never said, "I told you so." She said, "What are we going to do now?" Their daughter Susan described this 40 years later as the moment she understood what a real marriage looked like. Not two people who agreed about everything. Two people who could disagree without it becoming a referendum on the relationship. Research by psychologist John Gottman, whose work on marital stability beginning in the 1970s remains the most cited in the field, identified 4 patterns of relationship failure: contempt, criticism, defensiveness, and stonewalling. The couples who lasted longest were not those who argued least. They were the ones who argued without contempt, without turning a disagreement about a decision into a verdict on a person. The men of the 1950s didn't have Gottman's research. They had something older. They knew what a bad argument looked like, the kind that leaves marks, and they knew what a good one looked like. They were looking for a woman who could tell them they were wrong without needing them to feel small about it. Carol Alderman was that woman. George knew it within the first year, and he held on to it for life. Rule number 7. They looked for a woman who was building something, not waiting for something. In 1955, Thomas Hendricks was introduced to 2 women at separate social events within the same month. The first, Helen Bauer, talked primarily about what she hoped her future husband would provide: a nice house, financial security, a certain kind of life. The second, Margaret Ford, talked about what she was building. She was learning to sew her own curtains. She was saving money from her secretary's salary toward a sewing machine. She had specific plans for the kitchen she would eventually have. Thomas Hendricks married Margaret Ford in 1956. He said later that the difference was simple. One woman wanted to be given a life, the other was already in the process of making one. A 1,956 study by sociologist Mira Komarovsky at Barnard College found that women who entered marriage with practical agency, a demonstrated pattern of building, saving, and planning before marriage, showed dramatically higher rates of marital satisfaction and stability over the following decade. The woman who is already building something brings that capacity into the marriage. The woman who is waiting for something to begin often keeps waiting. Rule number 8. They looked for a woman who made peace with ordinary days. Walter Greer told his son David something about his wife Eleanor that David included in the family's notebook written in 2008. Walter had said this: "Your mother never needed the day to be special to be happy in it. Eleanor got up every morning at 6. She made breakfast. She raised 3 children through years that were, by most external measures, unremarkable. No vacations to speak of, no regular surprises. She did the ordinary work of an ordinary life with a consistency and a good nature that Walter described, 40 years into the marriage, as the thing he was most grateful for. Not the most exciting thing, the most grateful for." Abraham Maslow wrote that most human flourishing happens not in the peaks, but in the sustained quality of ordinary days. Research on life satisfaction has found consistently that marital happiness is predicted not by the frequency of extraordinary events, but by the quality of daily experience. Breakfast, conversation, small kindnesses, the texture of the Tuesday that nobody will ever write about. Today's entertainment complex has spent 70 years teaching people to expect extraordinary. No film shows the Tuesday. The entire architecture of modern romantic expectation is built on the premise that ordinary is failure. Eleanor Greer would not have recognized that premise. Walter knew what he had in her, and he held on to it for 40 years. Rule number 9. They looked for a woman who told the truth, even when it cost her. It was 1958. A man named Frank Corrigan had been seeing a woman named Dorothy Halsey for 4 months in Portland, Oregon. Frank was in the process of making a significant career decision, leaving a stable job at a printing company to start his own small shop. He asked Dorothy what she thought. Dorothy thought it was a mistake. She said so. She laid out her reasons clearly and without cruelty. The timing was wrong, the market uncertain, the risk underestimated. She ended by saying she would support whatever he decided, but he had asked for her honest opinion, and that was it. Frank thought about it for a while longer, and he went ahead with the shop anyway. It failed within 18 months. He came back to Dorothy and told her she had been right. Dorothy said, "I know. Now let's figure out what's next." What Frank remembered in a letter to his daughter in 1979 was not that Dorothy had been right. It was that she had told him the truth when agreeing would have been easier. He wrote, "A woman who tells you what you want to hear is comfortable. A woman who tells you what she actually thinks is valuable. I always wanted valuable." Research on long-term relationship satisfaction has consistently found that perceived honesty, the belief that your partner tells you their genuine assessment, even under pressure to agree, is among the top predictors of relationship trust. Couples who described high levels of truth-telling under pressure showed divorce rates significantly lower than those who described their communication as primarily accommodating. Life partners should not lie to each other. Frank Corrigan wanted valuable. He found it in a woman who told him the truth in 1958 and kept telling it for the next 40 years. Which brings us back to Robert Calloway, Tennessee, Knoxville, 1951. Sitting in Dorothy's father's front room for 20 minutes before saying a word to her about marriage. What Robert was doing, what all these men were doing, was choosing deliberately, not for excitement, not for chemistry. They were watching for character, for consistency, for the small signs that told a man whether the woman in front of him was built for the long road. The modern dating industry does not want you to think this way. It profits from volume, from the idea that the right person is always one more swipe away. It profits from the belief that chemistry is the same thing as compatibility, that feeling strongly about someone in the first 30 minutes means anything at all about how you'll feel about them in the 30th year. These men knew better, not because they were more sophisticated, because they had watched long marriages. They had learned that the woman worth choosing is not the most exciting woman in the room. She is the woman whose word means something, who can stay calm, who tells the truth, who is already building, who can disagree without destroying, who makes ordinary Tuesdays worth living. Robert Calloway asked Dorothy's father first. He stood in that front room for 20 minutes, and Dorothy, watching from the kitchen, knew what kind of man she was marrying before he said a word. Subscribe to Frank. The wisdom these men carry doesn't have to be lost. It just needs to be said out loud again. Dorothy's kitchen. 1951. Robert in the front room. Everything that matters already decided.